January 1945. The air inside the field hospital is thick with the scent of antiseptic and fear. Outside, the wind howls across the battered landscape of the Ardennes, carrying with it the distant thunder of artillery. Inside, under the flickering light of a single bulb, a young German soldier lies motionless on a blood-stained cot. His leg is swollen, the skin stretched taut and angry, the color of spoiled meat. The wound festers, the infection creeping up his thigh like a death sentence. He stares at the ceiling, lips cracked, eyes glazed with fever. He knows what comes next. The other wounded men have whispered it in the night. Gangrene, amputation. If he survives the saw, he will never walk again. If he doesn't, he will join the growing ranks of the nameless dead. Across the room, an American surgeon studies the chart, his brow furrowed. Supplies are low. Time is running out. But in his kit, he carries something new, a vial of golden liquid, precious and experimental. Penicillin. The war has brought them together, enemy and healer, in this small, cold room where hope is measured in milligrams. The surgeon glances at the soldier, then at the vial. A decision must be made. The world outside rages on. But in this moment, everything hangs in the balance, life, limb, and the future of medicine itself. Winter 1945. The Western Front is a landscape of ruin and desperation. The Battle of the Bulge has just erupted, the last great German offensive in the West. Snow blankets the forests and fields of Belgium and Luxembourg, muffling the sounds of war, but not the suffering. American and German forces clash in a brutal struggle for survival, the front lines shifting with every desperate counterattack. For the men on both sides, the enemy is not only the soldier across the line, but the cold, the hunger, and the wounds that come with every shell and bullet. The ground is frozen, making it nearly impossible to dig in or bury the dead. Frostbite claims toes and fingers. Shrapnel and gunfire tear flesh and bone. But for many, the greatest threat comes after the shooting stops. Infection. It is the silent killer of the battlefield. A simple wound, left untreated, can become a death sentence. Mud and filth grind into open cuts. Bandages are scarce, and clean water is a luxury. The wounded are carried back to aid stations on makeshift stretchers, their faces pale, their bodies shaking with fever. Medics do what they can, but the tools of modern medicine are still primitive by today's standards. For centuries, the fate of the wounded has been grim. Before the war, amputation was often the only answer to severe infection. Surgeons worked quickly, sometimes in the open air, their hands numb with cold, their instruments barely sterilized. The saw was feared more than the bullet. Gangrene, tissue death caused by infection, spread rapidly, turning healthy flesh black and foul. Once it set in, there was little hope. By 1945, some advances had been made. Sulfa drugs, discovered in the 1930s, offered a glimmer of hope, slowing the spread of bacteria. But they were not always effective, especially against the most aggressive infections. The war had become a race not just for territory, but for medical innovation. Every army knew that saving wounded men meant saving fighting strength. In the American lines, field hospitals sprang up behind the front, staffed by doctors and nurses working around the clock. They triaged the wounded, prioritizing those who could be saved. The most severe cases, those with deep wounds, shattered bones, or signs of gangrene, were often marked for amputation. It was a brutal calculus, but one dictated by necessity. On the German side, the situation was even more dire. Supplies were dwindling. Many doctors had been conscripted or killed. The wounded often waited hours, even days, for treatment. Infection ran rampant. The fear of the saw was universal. Yet, in the midst of this suffering, a new weapon was quietly making its way to the front. Penicillin, first discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, had been developed into a usable drug by Allied scientists. It was still rare, reserved for the most desperate cases. But for those lucky enough to receive it, penicillin could mean the difference between life and death, limb and amputation. The war was changing, not just on the battlefield, but in the operating room. The fate of thousands hung on the edge of a scalpel, and the promise of a tiny vial. The story of one German soldier and the American surgeon who held his future in his hands was about to unfold against this backdrop of chaos and hope. The story of penicillin is a story of chance, perseverance, and the relentless drive to save lives. In 1928, Alexander Fleming, a Scottish bacteriologist, returned from holiday to find a petri dish of Staphylococcus bacteria contaminated by a strange mold. Around the mold, the bacteria had vanished. Fleming had discovered penicillin, the world's first true antibiotic. But for more than a decade, the discovery remained a laboratory curiosity, difficult to extract, unstable, and nearly impossible to produce in quantity. It was not until the late 1930s and early 1940s, as the world edged toward war, that a team of scientists at Oxford, Howard Florey, Ernst Chain, and Norman Heatley, unlocked the secrets of mass production. With the outbreak of World War II, the need for a miracle drug became urgent. The United States and Britain poured resources into the effort, turning penicillin from a scientific oddity into a weapon of war. By 1944, penicillin was being produced in industrial quantities, but it was still precious. The Allies guarded their supply jealously. Most of it was reserved for their own wounded, for cases where all other treatments had failed. The drug was so valuable that used urine from treated patients was sometimes collected and processed to recover any remaining penicillin. For the Axis powers, penicillin was almost entirely out of reach. German doctors relied on older methods, sulfa drugs, antiseptics, and, when all else failed, the saw. The medical practices of the time reflected the brutal realities of war. Field hospitals were set up in tents, barns, or abandoned buildings, wherever there was shelter from the elements and a modicum of safety from shell fire. The wounded arrived in waves, carried by stretcher-bearers through mud and snow. Triage was swift and unsentimental. Those with minor wounds were patched up and sent back to the line. Those with mortal injuries were given morphine and left to die in peace. The rest, those with a chance, were operated on as quickly as possible. For wounds infected with gangrene, the prognosis was grim. The bacteria responsible Clostridium perfringens thrived in the oxygen-poor environment of deep wounds. It spread rapidly, producing toxins that destroyed tissue and released a foul odor. The skin turned black, the flesh liquefied, and the patient slipped into shock. Without intervention, death was inevitable. The only hope was to cut away the infected tissue, often sacrificing the limb to save the life. Amputation was a common fate. Surgeons worked with speed and efficiency, sometimes performing dozens of operations in a single day. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers feared the loss of a limb as much as death itself. For many, it meant the end of their usefulness, their identity, their future. Yet, in rare cases, penicillin offered a reprieve. When administered early and in sufficient doses, it could halt the spread of infection, allowing the body to heal. But the drug was still experimental, its effects not fully understood. Some doctors hesitated to use it on enemy wounded, fearing accusations of treason or waste. Others saw only the suffering in front of them and acted according to their conscience. In the winter of 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge raged and the fate of Europe hung in the balance, one such decision would be made. In a makeshift hospital, an American surgeon would face a choice: follow protocol or risk everything on a new and untested drug. The life of a German soldier and the future of battlefield medicine would depend on what happened next. The stage was set for a moment that would echo far beyond the frozen forests of the Ardennes. He was barely more than a boy, his face gaunt and eyes sunken from weeks of hunger and fear. His name, like so many others, would be lost to history, one of thousands swept up in the chaos of the Ardennes. He had been wounded during a night patrol, a jagged piece of shrapnel tearing into his thigh. The pain was immediate, but the true agony came later, as infection set in. The wound festered, the skin around it turning dark and swollen. Fever racked his body, and delirium blurred the line between waking and nightmare. He was captured by American troops, his uniform stained with blood and mud. Carried to a field hospital, he was just another enemy casualty, another body to be patched up or left to fate. Yet, beneath the uniform, he was simply a young man, terrified of what awaited him. He had heard the stories, how the Americans treated prisoners, how the wounded were left to die. But what he feared most was the saw. The thought of losing his leg haunted him, a fate worse than death for a soldier whose life had been defined by movement, by marching, by the simple act of standing tall. As he lay on the cot, shivering beneath a thin blanket, he clung to hope. Perhaps the doctors would find a way. Perhaps he would walk again. In the darkness, he whispered prayers to a God he was no longer sure was listening. The surgeon was a man hardened by war, his hands steady even as the world around him crumbled. He had seen too much, too many young men cut down, too many lives shattered by wounds that medicine could not heal. Yet, he had also seen the power of penicillin, the way it could turn the tide against infection, snatching men back from the brink of death. He studied the German soldier's chart, noting the rapid spread of gangrene. The standard protocol was clear: amputation, and quickly. But something in the boy's eyes gave him pause. There was fear, yes, but also a desperate hope. The surgeon weighed his options. Penicillin was scarce, reserved for Allied wounded. Using it on an enemy could mean trouble. But the oath he had taken, the reason he had become a doctor, echoed in his mind. Do no harm. He made his decision quietly, without fanfare. He would try the penicillin. If it failed, the saw would still be there. But if it worked, he might save not just a leg, but a life. The field hospital was a world unto itself, a place where the rules of war were suspended, if only for a moment. Here, the enemy was not the man in the opposite uniform, but the infection, the bleeding, the relentless march of death. Doctors and nurses worked side by side, their faces drawn with exhaustion, their hands stained with blood and iodine. Supplies were always short. Bandages were boiled and reused. Morphine was rationed. Every decision was a gamble. Every operation a race against time. The wounded arrived in waves, their cries echoing through the makeshift wards. Some would live, some would die, and some would leave a part of themselves behind on the operating table. Yet, amid the chaos, there was a sense of purpose. Every life saved was a victory. Every limb preserved a small miracle. The medical staff knew the odds were against them. But they fought on, driven by duty, by compassion, and by the faint hope that tomorrow might bring something better. In this crucible of suffering and hope, the fate of one German soldier would be decided not by the bullet or the bomb, but by the steady hand of a surgeon and the promise of a new medicine. Penicillin was more than a drug. It was a revolution in a vial. Its journey from Fleming's cluttered laboratory to the front lines of Europe was a story of scientific ingenuity and wartime urgency. The mold that produced penicillin was fragile, its yield minuscule. Early attempts to extract and purify the antibiotic were painstaking, each drop more valuable than gold. It took the combined efforts of British and American scientists and the resources of entire nations to scale up production. By 1944, factories in the United States were churning out penicillin, but demand always outstripped supply. The military controlled distribution, prioritizing the most severe cases and the highest-ranking officers. For every soldier who received the drug, Dozens more went without. The logistics of transport were daunting. Penicillin had to be kept cool, protected from light, and delivered quickly to where it was needed most. On the battlefield, penicillin was administered with reverence. Medics measured doses carefully, tracking every milligram. The results were often dramatic. Wounds that would have festered and killed began to heal. Amputations dropped. Survival rates soared. Yet, the drug remained a rare commodity. Its use a privilege rather than a right. For the German soldier in the American field hospital, the arrival of penicillin was a stroke of luck, a convergence of science, logistics, and compassion. In that moment, the future of medicine was no longer an abstract promise, but a tangible hope. War draws hard lines between friend and foe, but in the field hospital, those lines blur. The Geneva Conventions demanded humane treatment of prisoners, but reality often fell short. Resources were limited, and the needs of one's own men always came first. Enemy wounded were sometimes left to wait, their fates uncertain. Yet, there were moments when humanity prevailed. Some doctors saw only the suffering, not the uniform. They treated wounds, eased pain, and, when possible, saved lives, regardless of allegiance. These acts of mercy were not always popular. Some soldiers resented the care given to the enemy, seeing it as a betrayal. Others understood that compassion was its own form of resistance, a way to assert one's values in the face of brutality. For the American surgeon, the decision to use penicillin on a German prisoner was fraught with risk. He could be accused of wasting precious resources, of aiding the enemy. But in the quiet of the operating room, such concerns faded. The patient before him was not a soldier, but a human being in need. The war forced doctors and nurses to confront profound ethical dilemmas. Every day, they made choices that weighed life against death, loyalty against conscience. The Hippocratic Oath demanded care for all, but the realities of war demanded sacrifice and triage. The use of penicillin on an enemy soldier was a test of principle. Was it right to save the life of a man who might return to the fight? Was it just to deny him a chance at recovery because of the uniform he wore? These questions had no easy answers. For some, the answer was clear. Medicine was a universal good, a force that transcended politics and conflict. For others, the needs of the many outweighed the needs of the few. In the end, the decision rested with individuals, doctors, nurses, medics, each guided by their own sense of duty and compassion. Their choices, made in the heat of battle and the quiet of the ward, shaped not only the fate of their patients, but the future of medicine itself. As the surgeon prepared the first dose of penicillin, the weight of these questions hung in the air. The next hours would reveal not only the power of a new drug, but the enduring strength of the human spirit. The field hospital was silent except for the low hum of a generator and the distant rumble of artillery. The American surgeon stood at the foot of the cot, his hands gloved, his eyes fixed on the German soldier's leg. The wound was angry and swollen, the skin stretched and mottled with the unmistakable signs of gangrene. The stench was overwhelming, a sickly, sweet odor that clung to the air and signaled the presence of death. The medical team gathered around, their faces drawn and tense. The protocol was clear: amputation, and quickly. Delay could mean the infection would spread, claiming not just the limb but the life. The surgeon's assistant prepared the instruments, laying out the bone saw, clamps, and gauze. The nurse readied the morphine, her hands trembling slightly as she drew the dose. But the surgeon hesitated. He reached into his kit and withdrew the vial of penicillin, its golden liquid catching the light. He weighed it in his hand, feeling the gravity of the moment. This was not a decision to be made lightly. The drug was precious, its supply limited. Every dose given to an enemy was a dose not given to a comrade. Yet, the surgeon's mind was made up. He would not let the boy lose his leg, not if there was a chance to save it. He instructed the nurse to administer the first injection. The needle slid into the German soldier's arm, delivering the antibiotic into his bloodstream. The room was quiet, the tension palpable. The surgeon began to clean the wound, removing dead tissue and flushing the area with saline. He worked methodically, his movements precise and deliberate. The team watched, uncertain but hopeful. Hours passed. The soldier drifted in and out of consciousness, his fever raging. The surgeon checked the wound again and again, searching for signs of improvement. The first dose was followed by another, then another, each one a small act of defiance against the inevitability of the saw. Outside, the war continued. Shells fell in the distance, and the wounded kept coming. But inside the small operating room, time seemed to slow. Every heartbeat, every breath, was a measure of hope. By dawn, there was a change. The swelling had not worsened. The blackened skin had stopped spreading. The surgeon allowed himself a cautious optimism. He ordered more penicillin, rationing it carefully, watching for any sign of progress. The threat of amputation still loomed, but for the first time, there was a real chance the leg and the life could be saved. The next hours would be critical. The outcome was far from certain, but the battle had shifted, and the surgeon was determined to fight for every inch. The hours after the first dose of penicillin were a test of patience and resolve. The German soldier's fever spiked, sweat beading on his brow as he drifted in and out of delirium. The medical team watched for any sign, good or bad, that the infection was changing course. The surgeon checked the wound every hour, searching for the subtle signs that would mean the difference between hope and despair. By midday, the swelling had stabilized. The angry red streaks that had crept up the soldier's thigh began to fade. The blackened tissue, once spreading with alarming speed, seemed to halt its advance. The surgeon ordered another dose of penicillin, then another, each one a calculated risk. Supplies were low, and every milligram counted. But the results were undeniable. Where once there had been only the certainty of amputation, now there was a fragile possibility of recovery. Word spread quickly through the hospital. Nurses whispered about the German boy in bed 3, the one who was supposed to lose his leg but hadn't. Some of the American wounded looked on with curiosity, others with resentment. Why was so much effort being spent on an enemy? The surgeon ignored the murmurs. He focused on his patient, monitoring vital signs, adjusting treatment, and watching as the fever finally began to break. The German soldier, weak but lucid, opened his eyes. He saw the surgeon standing over him, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. The boy tried to speak, but his voice was little more than a whisper. The surgeon nodded, understanding passing between them without words. The worst had passed, but the road to recovery would be long. In the days that followed, the wound began to heal. The dead tissue was carefully removed, and healthy flesh started to knit together. The threat of gangrene receded. The leg, once marked for the saw, remained intact. The soldier would walk again, perhaps with a limp, but with both legs. The impact of the event rippled outward. Other doctors took note, some skeptical, others inspired. The use of penicillin on an enemy soldier was controversial, but the results were impossible to ignore. The hospital's commanding officer filed a report, noting the case as a rare but significant success. The story made its way up the chain of command, a testament to the power of science and the courage of those willing to defy convention. For the German soldier, the ordeal was not over. He remained a prisoner, his future uncertain. But he was alive and his leg was saved. For the American surgeon, the case was a vindication, a reminder that medicine could be a force for good. Even in the darkest of times, the war outside raged on, but inside the field hospital, a quiet victory had been won. The boundaries between enemy and ally, between old medicine and new, had shifted. The future of battlefield care would never be the same. The German soldier's recovery was slow but steady. Each day, the swelling in his leg diminished. The wound closed a little more, and the fever faded. He was moved from the critical ward to a quieter corner of the hospital, where he could rest and regain his strength. The American nurses, at first wary, began to treat him with the same care they gave their own. He learned a few words of English, enough to thank them, enough to ask for water or bread. The fear that had haunted his eyes was replaced by a cautious gratitude. For the American surgeon, the case became a touchstone, a story he would recount to colleagues, a lesson in the power of new medicine and the importance of compassion. He documented every step, every dose, every change in the patient's condition. His report was sent to the medical command, where it was read with interest and, in some quarters, skepticism. But the evidence was clear. Penicillin had saved a life and a limb where nothing else could. Word of the case spread beyond the hospital. Other surgeons, facing similar dilemmas, began to request penicillin for their most desperate cases, regardless of nationality. The boundaries of its use expanded, driven by necessity and the undeniable results. The American military, recognizing the drug's potential, accelerated efforts to increase production and distribution. By the spring of 1945, penicillin was reaching more frontline units, saving thousands of lives on both sides of the conflict. The impact on the war was profound, though not always visible in the headlines. Amputation rates among Allied wounded dropped dramatically. Soldiers who would have been lost to infection returned to duty, or at least survived to return home. The psychological burden on medical staff eased, replaced by a sense of hope and possibility. The knowledge that a wound was no longer a likely death sentence changed the way men fought, the way they endured. For the German prisoner, the end of the war brought new uncertainty. He was transferred to a prisoner of war camp, where he remained until the conflict ended. But he carried with him the memory of the American surgeon, the nurses, and the medicine that had saved him. In the years that followed, stories like his would be told and retold, testaments to the moments when humanity triumphed over hatred, when science overcame suffering. The use of penicillin in this single case was a microcosm of a larger transformation. The drug, once rare and experimental, was becoming a standard tool of war. Its success on the battlefield accelerated its adoption in civilian medicine, ushering in a new era of antibiotics and changing the course of medical history. Yet, the scars of war remained. The fields of Europe were littered with the remnants of battle, the hospitals still full of the wounded and the broken. But amid the devastation, there were glimmers of hope, small victories that pointed the way to a better future. The story of the German soldier and the American surgeon was one such victory, a reminder that even in the darkest times, compassion and innovation could light the way forward. The case of the German soldier treated with penicillin did not remain an isolated incident. As the Allies advanced deeper into Germany and the war neared its end, the use of penicillin became more widespread. Reports from field hospitals and medical units across the Western Front began to echo the same message. Penicillin was changing the face of wartime medicine. Official statistics from the U.S. Army Medical Department revealed a dramatic drop in mortality rates from wound infections. In 1943, before penicillin was widely available, nearly 20% of soldiers with severe infections faced amputation or death. By late 1944 and into 1945, that number had plummeted to less than 5% in units with access to the drug. The difference was not just in numbers, but in the stories of men who returned home with their bodies and futures intact. Medical journals and after-action reports documented the transformation. Surgeons described cases where wounds that would have been fatal just months before were now healing. The British Medical Journal and The Lancet published articles detailing the effectiveness of penicillin, not only for Allied soldiers but, in rare cases, for Axis prisoners as well. The ethical debates that had once raged in hospital tents and command posts began to subside, replaced by a growing consensus. The duty to heal transcended the boundaries of war. The shift in doctrine was profound. The U.S. Army issued new guidelines for the use of penicillin, emphasizing its role in treating all severe infections, regardless of the patient's nationality. The Geneva Conventions, already a framework for the humane treatment of prisoners, found new relevance as medical officers cited them in support of providing the best possible care to all wounded. The Red Cross and other humanitarian organizations took note, advocating for the global distribution of antibiotics in the post-war world. The impact extended beyond the battlefield. As penicillin production ramped up, civilian hospitals in the United States and Britain began to receive supplies. The drug's success in war accelerated its adoption in peace. Diseases that had once been death sentences, pneumonia, sepsis, syphilis, became treatable. The age of antibiotics had begun. For the medical staff who had witnessed the transformation firsthand, the experience was unforgettable. Letters and memoirs from doctors and nurses spoke of the relief and joy that came with each life saved, each limb preserved. Some recounted the skepticism they had faced, the difficult choices they had made, and the gratitude of patients who owed their lives to a chance discovery and a bold decision. The German soldier's story, though just one among many, became a symbol of what was possible when science and compassion worked hand in hand. His survival was a testament to the courage of those who dared to defy convention, to the power of a medicine that knew no borders, and to the enduring hope that even in war, humanity could prevail. The war would end in May 1945, but the legacy of those days in the field hospital would echo for generations. The lessons learned about medicine, about ethics, about the value of every human life would shape the world that emerged from the ashes. In the quiet aftermath of war, when the guns have fallen silent and the wounded have begun their long journey home, the true measure of progress is not found in the ruins of cities or the shifting lines on a map. It is found in the small, defiant acts of mercy that endure amid chaos. The story of a German soldier saved by an American surgeon's hand and a vial of penicillin is one such act, a moment when the boundaries of enmity dissolved in the face of suffering. Penicillin's arrival on the battlefield marked more than a medical breakthrough. It was a turning point in the history of humanity's struggle against disease, a promise that science could offer hope where once there was only despair. The decision to use it on an enemy, to risk precious supplies for a life that might otherwise have been lost, was a quiet assertion of shared humanity. In that cold, makeshift hospital, the war's divisions faded, replaced by the universal language of healing. The legacy of that moment endures. The age of antibiotics transformed not only medicine, but the very way we understand our responsibilities to one another. The lessons learned in war, about courage, about compassion, about the value of every life, became the foundation for a new era of care. The German soldier's survival was not just a victory over infection, but a testament to the power of empathy in the darkest of times. History remembers the great battles and the sweeping movements of armies, but it is in the quiet choices, the moments of risk and kindness, that the future is truly shaped. In the end, the story of penicillin on the battlefield is a story of hope, a reminder that even in war, the best of humanity can prevail.